Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is the final and fourth webinar this month, which introduces the new Winemason Portfolio 2021. You may have a copy of it already. If you don't, get in touch with us for a copy. This week, we are going to be joined by winemakers Jasmine Hirsch, and from the West Sonoma coast in California, and Richard Kershaw from Elgin. Yeah, guys are here. That's really cool. So this is Jasmine, this is Richard, and I'm really happy to bring these two guys together, because I think when you see their presentations, you'll see some of those parallels, if you like, between their situations and also I think their differences. We were just talking before we started about, you guys are really in some remote wine regions. And while those are, as you say, great for grapes, they may not be so great for internet connection and Zoom. So, we'll manage that as we go along. So fingers crossed. In choosing the title for this webinar, I deliberately included the word terroir in the title, which is kind of one of those terrifying wine words. But I thought it was really important because both Hirsch Vineyards and Richard Kershaw Wines make wine, and their wines come from very, I think, specific geographical areas. During their presentations, which will take about 20 minutes or so each, which is quite challenging because that's obviously quite short. So we'll see how we go for time, but they will try and explain as much as they can to you about how their wines are shaped by their climate, by their proximity to oceans, by their terrain, their soils, and by some of the viticultural and winemaking decisions that they make, which of course all contribute to terroir. And just to stay on terroir for a minute, I mean, if you were to follow a very strict French INAO kind of definition of terroir, you would of course also be looking for history, and that it should be over a long time, and that there should be some kind of consensus or some kind of collective agreement. So, going over centuries, if you're in the case of Burgundy. So let's just be clear that Elgin's vineyards were planted first in the mid 1980s, I think. Richard, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And that wines were first really only produced in the 1990s. And
actually 89. So
89.
Yeah,
wow.
first vineyards, yeah.
So, and Richard will tell you that he set up his winery. He was making wine for other people in 2012. And Hirsch Vineyards were first planted in your specific place in 1980. So again, not so long ago, right? But you've been making your own wine since 2002. So, but what I would say is, okay, these are new terroirs. They are terroirs that have just been recently discovered. And I think you will agree that it takes exceptional people and a real pioneering spirit and a real certain kind of person to develop and work in those terroirs. So the only other thing I kind of wanted to say before we get to Jasmine and then to Richard is that I first visited at Hirsch in 2018. Richard was also there at the same time on that trip. We were on a Master of Wine trip to California. And when we went up to that rather remote, difficult place to get to, which is Hirsch, it brought me back to a place I had first visited California in 1996. I was in San Francisco and I went up and booked, with college friends. We booked a house in Mendocino, just in Fort Bragg, just a good bit north of you. And personally, it brought me back to a place that I had been, very strong, very happy memories. And on tasting the wines, I very much wanted to bring them to Ireland. And you might say, well, there's a lot of great Pinot Noir available. There's, some interesting Californian USA Pinot Noirs in Ireland, but I didn't feel really genuinely that there was anything quite like Hirsch here already. And so I particularly wanted to import it. I kind of feel the same way about Richard's wines. Richard, I've known you for several years as part of the MW program, but I have rarely tasted Chardonnays that from anywhere, anywhere at all, that have been as pure and as fine and as precise as yours. So we will have questions at the end. Hopefully, I've got lots of questions, but so do the team here. But for the questions that you have, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, preferably if you can do that. We would really, really appreciate that. And is there anything anyone wants to say before we start, or can we kind of rock and roll and get straight to Jasmine? And you might tell us about where you are from and your wines.
Great.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I have the Q&A open. While screen sharing, I can't see the chat. So if you have questions while I talk, please use the Q&A. Don't hesitate to ask questions while I'm talking, because I'd love to answer them as I go along. So the first thing I just want to say is thank you, Barbara, for including me today. It's really exciting to get to talk with you and to talk with Richard, and to have this dynamic conversation today. So I'll give a brief overview of Hirsch Vineyards and our history and our wines. So I picked this first photograph because it's very much a typical view that you will see at Hirsch at sunset time. This is looking from our oldest vineyard, which, as Barbara mentioned, was planted by my father in 1980. And you're looking west, so you're looking out at the Pacific Ocean. Of course, you can't see the Pacific because it's hidden under fog, but it's only about 2.5 miles away as the crow flies, so very, very close to the ocean. When it's clear, you can actually see the ocean from this part of the vineyard. So we get a lot of really quite impactful weather coming off of the ocean, has a huge influence on the wines and on our viticulture. And this is the classic fog that comes in throughout the day, depending on the time of year, and just settles in these coastal ridges. And the trees that you're looking at are redwood trees. So very, very, speaking of terroir, and if we just speak of the climatic and the environmental aspects of terroir, so leaving aside history and culture, the redwood ridges of the Sonoma coast are a very specific place, has a really, creates a very unique climate and also unique soils. So millions of years of decomposing redwood trees has resulted in highly acidic soils. So just as a specific example of how the redwoods impact us. And the redwoods, of course, only live here because of the amount of fog that we get. They require that moisture. So it's really kind of a unique, highly specific part of the world, really special. And for us, really emotionally very, very connected to it. This is our home. So next slide, please. So this is my father, David Hirsch. He's from the Bronx in New York City. He was born in 1944 to a family that did not drink wine. And he grew up in New York and went to university, but it was the 60s. And he decided after about a year at college that he was more interested in being a hippie. So he dropped out of college and started hitchhiking across America. This is really kind of, I would say, quite a typical story about my father. He's very much an independent thinker. During college, he worked in a bar, of course, owned by someone else. But after that, he's never worked for anyone else in his life. He's been a lifelong entrepreneur. And a pioneer, really. So he dropped out of college and hitchhiked across America. He ended up settling in California. And actually, he lived in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which is an amazing, actually, viticultural region south of San Francisco. It's actually one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Pinot Noir growing regions in California. Pinot Noir was brought there from Burgundy by Paul Masson in the 1860s. And it actually has a very similar climate and feel to where we are. So also coastal ridges, redwood forest, and so on and so forth. So my father settled there in the 60s. He was working in the fashion industry. He started a company together with my mom that made casual women's clothing. And this work took them all over the world. So they would go to Europe quite a lot for inspiration. The clothes were manufactured in Asia. the textiles in India. So he became, sort of this global traveler. And, even though he had not grown up with wine, this kind of global lifestyle combined with living in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which had this homegrown, wine community, really sparked this interest for him in wine, and particularly in Burgundy. So living in the Santa Cruz Mountains, he became very good friends with a man by the name of Jim Beauregard, whose family owned a local supermarket. And, even though it was, late 60s, early 70s, at a time when most American supermarkets, weren't very interesting from a food point of view, this store actually had a really sophisticated wine selection and cheese selection, sophisticated at least for the time, as I understand from my father. And this was because Jim, while he was, really sort of required by his family to work in the supermarket business, had also developed this intense passion for viticulture and for the Pinot Noir of his home region. So my father became drinking buddies with Jim, and Jim introduced him to these wine merchants in San Francisco and so on and so forth. So when my father would go to Paris for work, he would leave Paris, he would add a couple days to his trip, take the train down to Burgundy, and he just fell in love with Burgundy. He fell in love with the lifestyle and the people. And it's really when he became introduced to this idea of terroir. And for him, he would sort of add, besides history and culture and climate and geology, he would really add, the lifestyle, really, the idea that you would eat and drink the foods and the wines from the place. He told me this story that, he would go to one of the villages in the Cotonui, and they would say, well, what's happening in the next village over? Because they really were sort of, they were farmers. They really didn't, it's much more, I'd say, dynamic now within Burgundy. But at that time, they people stayed home, and they really were focused on their little village. And that really kind of blew his mind. And my strongest memories of my father from when I was a child were of him, eating and drinking in restaurants. And, he's totally self-taught. He pronounces wine words wrong. Like he says Nebbiolo, which of course I thought was so embarrassing when I started to learn about wine, but now I think is adorable. So completely self-taught. And I think it allowed him, combined with his personality, which is very expansive. He's very charismatic. He loves meeting people. He's, he'll talk to anyone. He just was this absolute enjoyer of restaurant and dining and meeting people. And I think, that is a stronger memory for me as a child than of him, in the vineyards or anything like that. But, he really came to wine through this passion for how food and wine can be such a integral part of our lives, which is not something that, that's something that's coming now in America and in, American dining culture, but was really not, common at that time. So anyways, at the same time that all of this is happening, he's becoming really interested in he's becoming concerned, he's becoming concerned that California is getting crowded. Everybody's doing what he did and moving to California. And he said, I better buy a piece of land where I can, hide out, hear myself think, kind of retreat to before it becomes too expensive, which of course was very prescient of him, because now, California is just, it's just insanely expensive to buy land here. So in 1978, he found this old sheep ranch 2 hours north of San Francisco, so equidistance from where he was living to the south. So next slide, please. This will show you, sorry, this is the photo of my stepmother and my father and myself. This is during harvest. So next slide, please. And just the idea of sort of the agricultural community there. And next slide, please. Okay, great. So location. Sinead, I have to say, I think I sent you the link to the wrong slide. So we'll have to skip through some things, otherwise it'll be too long. So anyways, he found this old sheep ranch and north of San Francisco. So he was living south of San Francisco, but it really captured his imagination because it had the same kind of like coastal redwood forest and so on and so forth. And so this is just to give you an idea of where we are. Sonoma County, which is, Napa County is just to the east in this map. So right to your right on your screen. Sonoma County is enormous. just to give you an idea of the diversity of Sonoma, there are more soil types in Sonoma County than there are in all of France. So this is, and also there is tremendous climatic diversity. So obviously the Pacific Ocean's right there. So as you move away from the ocean, you go over a hill, there's a mountain, there's a gap or whatever, you can have incredible differences in climate. So Hirsch is in this dark green AVA, American Viticultural Area, which is called the Sonoma Coast, which is huge. It's probably the largest. I've not been able to get this exactly determined, but I think it's the largest or one of the largest American AVAs. I think we all know from studying wine that if you have a really huge region, it's challenging because there can be diversity. So you're like, what actually are the wines of the Sonoma Coast? So next slide, please. So we talk about the true Sonoma Coast, which is the part of the Sonoma Coast AVA that's actually along the ocean. And so you can see where Hirsch is. So we're sort of zooming in here. That red line is the dark sort of brownish red line is the boundary of the AVA. So you can see we sort of cut off the AVA to the east. There's parts of the Sonoma Coast AVA that are 40 miles from the ocean, so not coastal at all. The true Sonoma Coast does not have its own AVA, but it should soon. It'll be called the West Sonoma Coast. We've applied for it together with our neighbors, so it should be coming soon. Next slide, please. So if we zoom in even further, you can see where Hirsch is located right in the middle of the true Sonoma Coast or the West Sonoma Coast. And we actually have our own AVA here in our little community called Fort Ross Seaview. When you look at our bottles, you'll see Sonoma Coast on the front. We don't use Fort Ross Seaview on the front of the labels because it's a bit of a long, confusing name. It's what happens when you get 30 people in a room together to pick a name, but we really believe in this AVA. So my father was one of the two people that co-wrote the application to get the AVA. It's highly specific. It's very small, which allowed us to actually define this highly specific growing region. So the things that make the AVA unique, and this is also compared to the rest of the Sonoma Coast. So we're very close to the ocean. These are the vineyards that are the closest to the ocean on the entire Sonoma Coast. Highest elevation. So actually the AVA is not just this bright red boundary, but it's also defined by elevation. So if your vineyard has to be at 940 feet or higher, so about 300 meters or higher in order to be in the AVA. The elevation has a profound impact on the climate. So I mentioned we get all this fog, but sitting high up, you actually sit above the fog during the day, most of the growing season. And the last thing I would say, actually second to last thing, is we get a tremendous amount of rainfall. So the average rainfall in Fort Ross Seaview is 200 centimeters a year. So it's an incredibly rainy place. Technically, it's a temperate zone rainforest in the wintertime, but in the summertime, it's exactly like the rest of California. It's a Mediterranean climate. We get no rain at all. So it's like a desert here in the summer. And the last thing, this is actually the last thing, is that we are very close to the San Andreas Fault. So next slide, please. So a little bit about climate. We've talked about this a bit. So very close to the ocean, highly changeable climate. This photograph was taken in the exact same place as the very first slide. So you can see here, you can actually see the ocean. This is on a clear, sunny summer day. Next slide. This is a photograph that was taken in the late spring, early summer on our West Ridge, and you can see blue sky and fog, right? So the fog can come in multiple times per day in this part of the vineyard. Now, if you're further to one of our eastern slopes, you might get fog in the morning, but it will burn off and it won't come back the rest of the day because it's further from the ocean and it's a bit more protected. So what that means is that within the Hirsch vineyard, you have all of these different microclimates. And next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, we're just going to skip some because I sent the next slide, please. I sent you guys the wrong slide. I apologize. Wrong slideshow. So this comes to the San Andreas Fault, which is an extremely important actor on our site. So the San Andreas Fault is the fault line that defined and created the coast of California. So to your left, to the west, is the Pacific Plate. It goes all the way underneath the Pacific Ocean and meets Japan. On the east, you have the North American, or what we call the continental plate. Those two tectonic plates came together about 30 million years ago, crashed together, and then started. One Pacific plate went underneath the North American plate and started pushing up. So all that big black line is the San Andreas. All the little lines to the east are other fault lines. So we're in this very, very active seismic area. But which is a bit concerning from the point of view of earthquakes, but from a viticultural point of view, what that means is that we are farming literally in a fault zone. So my father calls this place earthquake terroir. We are half a mile at Hirsch from the San Andreas Fault. And I mentioned it started forming the coast 30 million years ago. From a geologic perspective, that's basically yesterday. So you have this incredibly complex melange of soils. Next slide, please. So this is a map of it's turned on its side. So to the north is to your right. It's the only way I could fit it. This is a map of the vineyard itself. So everything that has a line around it is part of Hirsch vineyards. So black indicates our 30 to 40-year-old vines, and the red is 20 to 25-year-old vines. Hirsch is considered to be a single vineyard. Over the years of our history, we started planting in 1980, making our own wines in 2002. Obviously a big gap of 20 years before we made any wine. So we were selling all those grapes. And all of these incredible winemakers in California have made, Hirsch vineyard Pinot Noir. We still sell a little fruit as well. And so there's this perception that Hirsch is a single vineyard, but it's much more like a village in Burgundy, which has, the village, you can say, has its own identity as a village, right? But then you can get a lot more micro and talk about the different parcels within the village. And that's the same thing at Hirsch. So it's really an incredible diversity of soils, diversity of climates within this very small area. So my father's response to that has been to divide it into these micro parcels. We have a parcel that is as small as 0.2 acres. I don't know what that would be in hectares, but tiny, tiny, tiny. And so every single parcel was planted individually, and now we farm and vinify each of them individually. So I will take a moment to answer a couple of these questions. We were affected by the fires last year. So about 50% of our crop was affected by the smoke coming from the east. So about 50% of the 2020 vintage will not be usable on account of the smoke damage, but half the vintage is actually perfect. So, and it was an amazing, amazing vintage. So we learned a lot. We picked everything, even the stuff that was, if we thought was likely to be affected by the fires, because we felt that this was an opportunity to learn. We're 100% estate, biodynamic. All of our costs up to the point of harvest, were tremendous, right? Because we spend so much time and money on the farming. So we said, okay, we've got tanks. We might as well pick it and see what we can learn. And so it's been actually a really, really interesting learning experience for us in the cellar. And then regarding the disease pressure, it's really interesting. We have a tremendous amount of seasonal disease pressure here, a lot of powder, a lot of mildew and rot pressure on account of the fog. When we converted to biodynamics, that was a big fear of ours, that we were going to, having to give up chemical fungicides. We were really worried that was going to be a real challenge, but actually it's not been. We've always been very meticulous farmers, so very, very attentive to canopy management. We are just simply more so. And actually the biodynamics really seems to have strengthened the farm as it should, and strengthened the plants. So we actually are seeing less seasonal disease pressure. And it's really difficult to say at this point how climate change could affect the fog patterns. 2017, we had almost no fog, which was really scary, and it was really warm. And we thought, oh, is this going to be the new normal? But then 2018 and 19 were more like a typical foggy summer vintage. So it's really hard to say. Do acidic soils translate to wines with high acidity? Actually, it's usually the opposite. And the challenge with the highly acidic soils in certain places has been not just the acidic soils, but actually very high magnesium soils, which is one of the soil series that we have here is very high magnesium clay. Actually, that's a bigger challenge than the high acidity in the soils because magnesium is inhospitable to plants. So actually we have really quite a lot of struggles with the soil. The other thing I would say is, you know, being on these high altitude steep slopes used to all be covered in redwood forest. The trees were cut down long before we got here. And then we get all that rainfall. So actually a lot of the topsoil has washed away. My father believes that if the land had not been logged and we did not have all of that rainfall, that actually it would not be a great place for viticulture, because we would the soils would be too rich. So actually we're really farming on these very low vigor subsoils. So one more slide and then I'll hand it over. So thank you for those great questions. So this slide is, I think, a fun slide just to kind of compare the fragmentation of our vineyard to Burgundy. This is not to compare Hirsch to Gevrey-Chambertin or Moray-Saint-Denis. The vineyards, the lines in blue are an outline of our farming blocks, overlaid to scale, so meter to meter, on top of this section of the Côte de Nuit. So this was actually created by a journalist who was giving a talk on terroir in the New World. And the point he wanted to make here was, you know, if we can believe that Chambertin and Clos de Bez are two different terroirs and, you know, worthy of being two different bottlings, you know, maybe we can extend that same idea to, you know, new places as well. And in fact, actually what you can see here is that our parcel size is much smaller than in Burgundy. And that's because it's really essential here, because our soil formation is so young. Some of the soils are very old here, but the formation of them through the action of the San Andreas Fault is really recent. So nothing has homogenized here. So this is really an essential approach to the farming in order to manage the complexity of the site. And last thing I'll say before handing off to Richard is just about the winemaking. Actually the next slide's great. Every single one of these little parcels has its own tank, vinified individually, barreled down individually, and then aged individually, so that we can make the different wines that we make. Currently available for you guys, coming soon, is the Bohan Dillon, which is 2019 vintage. It's sort of our answer to a Village Burgundy, made from the parts of the vineyard that are a little bit less tannic, more drinkable young. It's got fruit from all over the vineyard. And then the San Andreas, which is also has fruit from all over the vineyard, 2018 vintage. And that is, you know, sort of our flagship wine. It's really intended to show you the whole vineyard in one glass. So more structure, more complexity. And then the last wine that will be arriving soon is the Ration Ridge Pinot Noir, from one of those very specific little parcels that we feel has its own terroir, its own expression. And there's a number of spots around the vineyard that have that. So we approached it from two directions. There's a macro terroir of Hirsch, you know, captured through these wines, Bohan Dillon, San Andreas. And then there's all of these little micro terroirs, and we make about 5 or 6 different wines like that. The Ration Ridge is one of them. Really, a really exciting part of the vineyard that produces quite explosively aromatic wines that seem quite luscious and Californian, if you will, on the nose, but have this incredible tension and energy and structure on the palate. So also 2018 vintage. So I hope you guys will enjoy the wines when they arrive. And thank you so much for your interest.
Thanks, Jasmine. That's fantastic. I don't know how you managed to cover all of that in such a short space of time. And I learned some new things.